In 1941, a recruiting clerk slid a folder across a desk and read Matthew Fink's measurements, like routing instructions. 5 feet 5, 139 pounds. The clerk's eyes moved from the paper to Fink's narrow shoulders and back again. Then the pen wrote a single word that fit the system: clerical. The result was a clean assignment away from the front, and the cost was that the assignment treated his body as a limit instead of a capacity. Fink spoke before the rubber stamp could fall. He volunteered for Airborne. The clerk looked up, surprised less by the request than by who was making it, and asked whether Fink understood the washout rate. Fink did, and he said so without decorating the answer. He explained briefly that he had spent years behind other people's decisions and did not intend to spend the war that way. The result was a second set of forms and a new processing code. The cost was a warning delivered in a flat voice. If he failed, there would be no second sorting. He would be sent wherever the army sent men who could not meet a standard. He signed anyway. The stamp came down with a soft thud that sounded harmless in the quiet office. The result was a reassigned file, and the cost arrived fast and physical. Within weeks, he stood in a Georgia training camp where the schedule was designed to grind down bodies until only the compliant remained. A sergeant singled him out by size and tried to save time by humiliating him into quitting. Fink did not argue, because arguing was noise that did not move him forward. He ran when told to run, carried weight when told to carry, and used the only advantage he could manufacture: rhythm. While larger men surged and faded, he kept an even cadence that turned pain into something countable. The result was that he stayed in formation when others fell out. The cost was that his shins inflamed, his shoulders rubbed raw under straps, and sleep stopped feeling like recovery. Midway through the first week, his chest tightened until the air felt rationed. His vision narrowed and his legs threatened to fold. He kept moving because stopping would have made his struggle visible, and visibility in that place meant a truck back to the clerical drawer. He finished the run upright, then stood still while the sergeant's eyes searched for weakness. The result was that his name stayed off the evening list of washouts. The cost was that he learned what it felt like to function while the body screamed for a different decision. That night, he lay on his bunk and listened to men bargain with God, pain, or luck. Fink did not bargain. He reviewed the rules the way he had reviewed office procedures in civilian life: finish every ordered movement, hide damage unless it stops function, and treat each day as a separate test instead of a verdict on his worth. The result was a plan that fit his temperament. The cost was that he stopped expecting comfort from anyone, including himself. On the obstacle course, he slipped on a rope climb and heard laughter rise beneath him. A fall would be an injury would be paperwork would be removal. He corrected the error by changing method instead of adding force, locking the rope with his feet, climbing slower but without wasting motion. He cleared the station and ran on, refusing to look down at the men who had laughed. The result was survival inside the course's logic. The cost was attention. The sergeants noticed the small man who did not break, and attention in that place always turned into another test. The towers turned attention into a direct threat. From 34 feet, the body's refusal to step off a platform became a physical force. Fink stepped off anyway. The cable caught, the harness snapped his hips, and the landing went stiff because fear tightened the joints he needed loose. Pain shot up his ankle, and he tasted blood where his teeth cut his cheek. The result was that he stayed in the program. The cost was a joint that would ache whenever the weather changed and whenever his mind returned to the moment. On the next cycle, he watched another trainee reach the platform and stop. The man's boots shifted, then froze as if the body could negotiate with gravity. A sergeant barked, grabbed the harness, and forced the step. The man rode the cable down rigid, hit the ground wrong, and did not get back in line. The result was an empty bunk that night and one fewer mouth in the barracks. The cost was that Fink learned the program did not punish fear with lectures. It punished fear with removal. Fink wrapped his ankle, tightened his boot until the pain went numb, and climbed the tower again. He stopped chasing bravery and chased repetition. feet together, knees locked, roll across muscle, not bone. He practiced until the fear remained but stopped overruling technique. The result was competence built out of controlled falls. The cost was that he understood in a way no briefing could provide that airborne work demanded a man override instinct on command. The first aircraft jump made that demand absolute. The engines drowned speech and the red light near the door turned time into a countdown. The jumpmaster hooked static lines, slapped helmets, and treated each man like equipment that either functioned or got replaced. When the light flipped green, the door opened, and the wind erased every remaining illusion of safety. Fink's mind offered retreat as a simple solution. He rejected it because he had already rejected it in the recruiting office. He stepped out. The air tore at him. The static line yanked the pack. The canopy opened with a crack that drove pain into his shoulders. The result was a living parachute and a descending body. The cost was the knowledge that a single mechanical failure could turn skill into a funeral report. He landed hard, rolled, and stood. In a line afterward, wings were pinned to his chest with no sentiment that mattered to him. The metal proved only one thing. He had paid the entry fee. The cost that followed was implied, and it would be collected later. Within days, he was reassigned to a company with men who had already seen combat. A veteran corporal glanced at Fink's wings and then at his size and said nothing, which was worse than a joke because it implied the wings meant nothing. The result was a new proving ground. The cost was that Fink understood he had traded one label for another and would have to pay again to change it. In a veteran company, wings bought no respect. The sergeant who ran Fink's platoon watched him like an auditor watches a suspect ledger, quietly, waiting for the first discrepancy. Fink was placed on the margins of movement, given errands under fire, and expected to fail without disturbing the main effort. He carried ammunition, crawled messages between positions, and learned that the smallest man was often assigned the narrowest paths. The result was that he learned the unit's habits from the edges. The cost was constant exposure without status. He took the first opportunity to prove the sergeant's warnings had landed. When the platoon needed a runner to carry an order between positions, Fink moved without waiting to be chosen. He stayed low, used ditches and walls, and delivered the message with his breath burning in his throat. The result was that the platoon moved when timing mattered. The cost was that he learned how quickly a short sprint can feel like a lifetime when every step is exposed. During a night movement, a machine gun opened ahead and collapsed distance into a single sound. Fink's mind tried to solve the new equation, direction, angle, range before his feet moved. That fraction of delay was enough. The man in front surged anyway and took a round in the shoulder. Fink dropped beside him, grabbed his webbing and dragged him into a ditch while dirt sprayed their faces. The result was that the wounded man stayed alive long enough for the medic. The cost was that the platoon slowed in the lane and men behind them had to take risks to keep the line from tangling. Afterward, the sergeant stated the lesson without comfort. Fear was permitted. Hesitation killed. He told Fink that the next pause would purchase someone's death, and the unit would not care whose. The result was clarity delivered like a threat. The cost was that Fink carried the warning as a weight that pressed on every decision afterward. A week later, daylight pinned the platoon in a shallow depression while an enemy gun swept their approach in steady bursts. Mortars were ruled out because the margin for error was too small, and waiting produced only more bleeding. Fink watched the sweep and noticed a seam in the ground, a dip that broke the gun's line for a few yards. It was not safety, it was geometry. The result was a possible route. The cost was that the route demanded a single body absorb the risk while everyone else stayed pinned. Fink crawled to the sergeant and traced the route in dirt. He did not call it bravery. He called it the only option that did not depend on luck. The sergeant followed the line with his eyes and gave one condition: no pausing. Permission was not encouragement. It was a calculation that Fink's smaller profile might buy seconds. The result was authorization. The cost was that the platoon's movement would now hinge on a man they still treated as expendable. Fink moved in inches, timed to the gun's rhythm. When the burst swept left, he advanced. When it swept right, he pressed into the dirt. Impact struck near enough to sting his face with grit, and each one reminded him that the seam was only a thinner margin of death. He reached the rear angle, pulled a grenade, forced his fingers steady, counted just long enough to avoid the blast, and threw it into the firing slit. The gun stopped. The result was a lane opening behind him. The cost was that the position did not die quietly, and the lull tempted men to stand too soon. Rifles answered from within, and a second weapon somewhere tried to bracket the rise. Fink shifted along the back and found an access trench. He fired into it until a scream confirmed effect and the magazine emptied. He did not wait to confirm more than that. He moved because the platoon needed motion, not certainty. Behind him, boots rose and men surged forward through space the gun had owned. The result was forward movement. The cost arrived immediately. A round struck Fink's thigh with blunt force. Heat spread, then wetness, and the leg threatened to fold under him. He dragged himself into deeper ground, tore cloth, cinched it tight above the wound, and measured blood loss the way he measured distance, as a limit that would end his choices. The sergeant slid down beside him, checked the line, and said only that Fink had not paused. The result was a kind of acceptance. The cost was a wound that would follow him long after the lane closed, and would keep returning as a reminder of what each decision purchased. The action was written up later in language that cleaned mud into conspicuous gallantry. Fink did not see the full paperwork chain, but he felt its consequences when an officer called him in and demanded a clean sequence. Fink described the seam, the timing, and the count before the throw, then corrected the officer when the officer tried to turn the moment into a story about fearlessness. The result was a record that could survive scrutiny. The cost was that Fink learned how easily violence could be translated into praise that missed the real transaction. After the war, in a room too quiet for his taste, a clerk read a citation with the calm tone used for regulations. Fink stood at attention while words turned fear and blood into sentences meant to be applauded. The medal placed in his hands made him visible to strangers who wanted a symbol. The result was public honor. The cost was that honor became another label, and labels were always used by systems to root men. People offered him the expected path: speeches, parades, a curated desk, and a public narrative. Fink declined and returned to Pittsburgh, to a building full of desks where veterans waited to be sorted again, this time by rules instead of bullets. He took a job in the Veterans Benefits Office because he recognized the mechanism. Paperwork still decided who ate, who got medicine, and who was called a liar. The result was stability and proximity to the problem. The cost was that he placed himself in a second battlefield where the injuries were quieter and harder to measure. His supervisor trained him in the office's doctrine: process, do not fix, follow schedule, protect numbers. Exceptions, the supervisor warned, would drown a clerk in endless appeals. Fink nodded because he understood drowning, and then he opened a file that made the doctrine feel like an excuse. A veteran's claim had been denied for insufficient documentation. On paper, it was closed. In person, the veteran arrived with a damaged hand, a denial letter, and anger sharp enough to make other clerks reach for security. Fink kept the man in the chair by speaking in a steady tone and asking for facts that could be anchored: dates, units, field hospitals, the name of any officer who had signed anything. The veteran had little. Poverty does not preserve records. The result was that the anger shifted into usable fragments. The cost was that the fragments demanded time. The supervisor warned Fink again about productivity. Fink answered with a choice he had made before. He would spend the time required to find the missing piece. He requested unit logs, called records depots, and cross-checked rosters until he found the hinge of the denial in a single digit. The veteran's service number had been typed wrong in a field hospital entry, and that mistake erased the injury from the system. Fink corrected it, rebuilt the evidence chain, and rewrote the assessment in the office's own language so it could not be dismissed as sympathy. He stamped the approval himself. The result was a letter that granted pay and care. The cost was friction, because correcting the system made the system admit it could be wrong. To protect the decision, Fink wrote a memo that treated the case like an audit. He documented the error, attached the corrected chain of evidence, and cited the exact rule the office claimed to obey. He was not asking permission. He was building a shield that made reversal expensive. The result was that his supervisor could not easily undo the approval without exposing the office to review. The cost was that Fink became a known problem, assigned heavier caseloads and watched for slippage. The supervisor escalated by calling a staff meeting and using Fink as a cautionary example. He talked about mission creep, emotional decisions, and the danger of encouraging fraudulent claims. The aim was clear: isolate Fink by framing his work as sentimentality. Fink answered with citations rather than indignation. He read the relevant regulation aloud, showed how the corrected service number satisfied the office's own evidentiary standard, and placed his call logs and depot responses on the table. The result was that the supervisor lost the room and had to retreat in front of witnesses. The cost was that co-workers stopped chatting when Fink walked into the break room, as if diligence were contagious. After the meeting, the supervisor tested him with workload rather than argument. Fink was assigned a stack of older denials marked non-priority, cases that had waited long enough to become invisible. He responded by building a small checklist for himself: verify identity numbers, cross-check units, request missing logs once and only once, document every call so the work would not collapse into guesswork. He worked the stack from top to bottom without drama, writing short addenda where records supported a correction and writing clear denials where nothing could be verified. The result was steady progress that looked like compliance on the weekly report. The cost was that the work retaught him a familiar battlefield truth: keep moving, accept isolation, and do not expect relief. A week later, the veteran returned with an approval letter in his good hand and disbelief in his eyes. He thanked Fink without language strong enough to fit what the letter meant. Fink accepted the thanks because refusing would have been another performance, and then he opened the next file. The result was continued work. The cost was a clear realization that peace had its own attrition, and that one corrected record could not fix a system built on missing proof. The office ran on predictable noise until an outside boom broke its rhythm. Construction across the street drove steel into earth, and the impact traveled through glass into Fink's ribs. His hand froze above a form, and the present thinned. The result was a sudden return of the machine gun's rhythm inside his head. The cost was visible. His pen punched through the paper and tore it, ink spreading like a wound. A colleague asked whether he was all right. Fink smoothed the torn form, blamed the paper, and forced air in through his nose in measured counts. The result was that he kept the system from noticing. The cost was that control required constant labor. After that, triggers multiplied. Sharp laughter, shouted words, certain surnames on files, the smell of wet wool in winter coats. Each one threatened to pull him back. Each one demanded a counter-procedure. He built those procedures with the same discipline that had kept him in training. He arranged his desk in exact patterns so his hands could do something reliable when his mind tried to flee. He took short walks to a quiet hallway at set times because unpredictability made the memories sharper. He kept water on schedule because dehydration amplified panic. He timed his breathing until his heart slowed. The result was function that looked normal from the outside. The cost was exhaustion that never appeared on any timesheet and never earned sympathy because it looked like nothing. At home, the war expressed itself in angles and silences. Fink chose the chair that faced the door. He kept his voice level, even when startled. His children learned not to slam doors and to watch his eyes for the moment they drifted away from the room. The result was a household that adapted. The cost was an unnamed distance that grew because it was never explained. One evening, his daughter found the medal box in a drawer and carried it to the dinner table. The family's attention narrowed onto velvet and metal, proof of a life they had not been invited into. Fink closed the box with a small joke about paperwork and reclaimed it without anger. The result was immediate safety for the room. The cost was that the question became heavier because it had been touched and then shut away. After the children slept, his wife stood at the doorway and said their children wanted to know him. Fink answered that he was present, and she replied that presence was not the same as sharing. The result was truth spoken without resolution. The cost was a deeper quiet between them. Fink justified his silence as protection. He did not want them carrying what he carried. The cost was that they carried the outline anyway. Night awakenings, a flinch at sudden noise, a man who kept his most important sentence behind his teeth. Years passed as a long campaign of files. Fink won some cases by locating missing documentation, rewriting assessments, and refusing to let veterans be erased by clerical errors. He lost others because the system demanded proof from people who had only memory and scars. Each win cost time and earned supervisor irritation. Each loss cost sleep. The result was a career of partial victories. The cost was cumulative. Patience shortened, the breach widened, and the urge to close himself off grew stronger because closing off reduced pain. One loss fixed itself in his mind because there was no clerical error to correct. A veteran came in with tremoring hands and a story that matched every pattern Fink recognized. But the unit records had burned and the witnesses were dead. Fink searched anyway, called depots, and wrote requests that came back stamped "No record found." He drafted an appeal, attached every scrap of corroboration he could find, and watched the appeal return denied with the same bland phrasing he had learned to write himself. The result was a denial he had to sign with his own name. The cost was that he watched the veteran's face collapse as if struck and understood that paperwork could injure as surely as a weapon. When he retired after 27 years, the office offered coffee, a plaque, and words like "dedicated." Fink accepted, thanked them, and walked out with a box of pens, a unit photograph, and the habit of turning problems into procedures. The result was freedom from the desk. The cost arrived in the silence of his own house. Without office noise, the past spoke louder. He tried to replace the desk with volunteer work at first, thinking movement might keep the mind quiet. After a few weeks, he stopped. Listening to other veterans' stories without having the authority to change the outcome felt like standing at the edge of the lane with no grenade in hand. The result was that he returned to his own routines. The cost was that he admitted the office had not only been a job, it had been a cover position. He filled the empty days with structure because structure was the only language he trusted. He organized papers, labeled envelopes, wrote down phone numbers for benefits offices in case his wife ever needed them, and noted medical appointments in careful handwriting. The result was order. The cost was that order did not prevent what came next. Cancer entered his life with its own forms, and he signed them the way he had signed the Airborne volunteer sheet, precisely, without drama, because drama did not change outcomes. As treatment weakened him, he opened the medal box one winter afternoon and looked at the metal without touching it. The action was deliberate: acknowledge, confirm, close. The result was a controlled meeting with the past. The cost was an admission that nothing had ever been fully filed away. He had only learned to keep moving beside it and to keep other men moving when the system tried to stop them. In the last weeks, his daughter sat by his bed and apologized for opening the box years earlier. Fink told her she had done nothing wrong. When she asked what he had done, he refused the clean, heroic story and gave the procedural truth. He jumped when the light turned green, and afterward he tried to keep other men from being lost in forms. The result was the closest thing to explanation he could offer. The cost was that it still left much unsaid, because unsaid was how he had survived. After his death, the world handled him with the machinery he had spent his life resisting and using. Calls made, signatures gathered, dates confirmed, a burial place chosen among other names. He was placed under a simple marker that listed only rank and years, a section and a number that looked like an index entry rather than a story. The result was inclusion in a national memory that resembled rows of closed files. The cost was that the details, the seam he crawled, the count before the throw, the ink that bled through paper, were absorbed into silence. In the end, the two desks were not opposites. One desk tried to sort him into safety. He refused and chose open air because he could not accept disappearing behind other people's decisions. The other desk tried to sort other men into rejection. He refused and used stamps and sentences as tools because he could not accept watching them vanish behind regulations. His wings proved he would jump. His seal proved he would reach back.